So the next step is putting the center pin of your circle guide into the hole. On MDF, your hole will be a standard 1/8 of an inch because MDF is pliable enough that you can shove the 1/8 inch pin into the 1/8 inch hole. But with acrylic and harder materials, you probably want to go with a 9/64 bit that gives a little bit of extra clearance, because if you try to do it in the hole, you might be able to get it in, but it's really hard to get it back out. So you always want to cut your outer ring first, because if you cut your inner ring first, then you're going to lose the center when you try to cut your outer ring. So always cut your outer ring first. Now that you have your markings on your actual piece of MDF, what you want to do is bring the router bit down, get it really close where it's hovering just above the surface of your MDF, and then with the adjustment knob loose, you want to set it up so that you're on the scrap side of your cut. Rotate your bit so it's at the cut is on the fulcrum of the circle, so it's not turned to the wrong way. You want to make it so it's at the tip of its cutting edge, and then bring it in and visually confirm that you're right on the edge. What you can do is, once you set it, you could spin the bit and then make sure that it's, you know, the cutting edge is right up against your measurement, and then tighten your set screw. Before you use any power tools, whether it's the router or table saw, you want to make sure you're using your safety goggles. Another thing, when you're working, we have a good dust collection system here, but if you're working without dust collection or bad dust collection, you want to protect your lungs too with a good respirator. This is a lightweight, you know, nuisance level dust mask, and it breathes real nicely, and it's lightweight. I'm not going to use it right now because you won't be able to hear me, but definitely wear your safety goggles and your dust mask. Before you make your first cut, you want to rotate your depth stop to the highest position, which I'll show you here. And you notice with this router bit touching the surface of the MDF, you still have a 1/4 inch gap between your depth stop and the plunge stop. So what we'll do is fire up the router and make one rotation at the 1/4 inch height. We're going to make 3 cuts so that we cut this 3/4 inch MDF in 1/4 inch increments. So we're going to make those 3 cuts. What you want to do is turn the router in a slow and even manner. Clockwise or counterclockwise, it doesn't really matter. And once you're done with the cut, you want to allow the router to plunge back up, or else you won't be able to rotate the depth stop. Then you're going to rotate your depth stop to the next position, and then fire up the router, and then plunge it down. You always want to keep 2 hands on the router, and after each cut, it's a good idea to rotate the router back 1 rotation in order to keep the cord from getting tangled up. And another good way to keep the cord from getting tangled up is to hold the cord in 1 hand as you're rotating. In order to make our last cut, we're going to rotate the depth stop to its final lowest position, and then start the router and plunge and make our last cut. As you might have noticed, the piece of MDF isn't trying to move at all, and even with the final cut, the router pad or the non-slip mat keeps the pieces in place so they're not moving around, and the piece isn't trying to slip at all while you're cutting. Yet, when you pull the pieces apart, if you set your depth gauge right, zeroed out your router properly, and pushed all the way down when you're cutting your last cut, you should have your router come out perfectly, or your ring come out perfectly. Now, if you set your depth gauge properly, you'll notice that the router pad is barely marked because the router bit didn't plunge that far into the router pad, and you'll be able to use a router pad for many cuts without having to replace the pad on top. If you're only making one ring, now you can adjust it to cut the inside diameter, but if you're making multiple rings the same size, you want to do all your outside cuts first and then switch over and do all your inside cuts. Just check for quality control. You want to make sure that your ring is what your intended diameter is, and there we are, exactly at 10 inches.